Good morning and welcome to Sunday School at First Baptist Church. I'm happy you're here with us today as we continue our study in the book of John. Remember what John's objective is. He wants to demonstrate through the signs that Jesus himself gives that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the Son of God. And as we've been through and traveled through these first 8 chapters and now looking at chapter 9, we see that Jesus uses a lot of different methods and some of the miracles that he performs depending on the purposes that he might have. Sometimes he simply speaks a word that causes healing in a person. Sometimes he touches people to cause healing. And sometimes he might use some other substance. Today he'll use spit and mud, which is kind of an unusual thing to perform a miracle. We don't know why he chose different methods to use that, to accomplish that, but the point is that he accomplished what he set out to do. He taught different lessons based on what he did. And the thing that means the most is the end result. And so let's don't get lost in trying to research the method. Let's remember what the results are. As with most of those healings, the Pharisees would try to find out something wrong, and what we see here at today's lesson is that they see it as a Sabbath healing. It's working on the Sabbath, and they accuse Jesus of this, what we might call a mortal sin, for saving someone's sight or for healing someone who's been lame on the Sabbath. And so they attack him for violating the Sabbath. But it doesn't stop Jesus. Jesus is the person who wants to make sure that he can make people whole, not just physically, but spiritually. And I think we see that today. Let's begin looking at chapter 9 today by looking at the first 3 verses. John writes that as he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man or his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life." The blind beggar that we see here, according to most commentators, must have been pretty well known in the community. Been blind since birth. It appears that he's an adult now because his parents testify to that, and he's been out here in the public begging, seeking alms for a long time. But what do the disciples want to know? They don't want to know, how do we heal this man? Can you heal this man? They say, who sinned? Why would they ask that question? Well, the reason for that is in the society in which they lived, it was a society that thought everything happened as a result of a cause. It was cause-effect. If somebody were crippled, if somebody were blind, then something caused that they had done. In most cases, they blamed it on sin. Even to the point that in this case, they thought perhaps this person had committed some sort of sin in the womb of his mother. But the grammatical construction of this sentence here, one of our commentators tells us, who's real familiar with the language, that the grammatical construction indicates a specific act of sin which caused the specific condition or affliction. Literally, who committed a sin with the result that this man was born blind. In this case, probably the rabbis would explain it as some sort of a congenital defect that was caused by sin in the womb by the fetus, or it could be blamed on the iniquity of the fathers being visited upon the children to the 3rd and 4th generation. So it could have been somebody in his past heritage that he didn't even know, according to them. The disciples approached this tragedy then with looking for someone to blame. But Jesus approached it with looking for someone to heal. How could he change someone's life? They were interested in human causes, and Jesus was interested in spiritual results and divine results and in spiritual healing for a person. So he refused to be drawn in to that argument that said all suffering is always the direct result of someone's sin. He looked at it as an opportunity for him to minister, for him to demonstrate God's grace in the work of a human life. At no point does Jesus in this story follow up on the question that was originally asked, because he thinks it's immaterial. He wants to work toward the display of God's grace. In being healed of his unexplained blindness, he would become an example of God's great mercy rather than of his wrath. Jesus' answer in verses 3 through 5 makes it clear that this man's blindness was not a result of something he had done. It was simply the work of God. Jesus would do his work here as the light of the world, and he's the only one who could penetrate the darkness that this man experienced. And so we look and see what he does. Look in verse 4. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. We see here that Jesus sees some urgency here. And we see this throughout his ministry. He talks about the time is short. And if you think about it, Jesus was here on this earth for 33 years. His ministry was only 3 of those 33 years, less than 10%. And so he said the time is short. He says, as long as it is day, we've got to work and do my Father's work. The days of flesh are short. They are for us too. But if Jesus knew that his days were on the earth were limited, opportunity was limited. The night is coming. That's when everything shuts down. That's when he's not going to be able to perform any of those things anymore. So his immediate opportunity was to bring physical light to an unfortunate man who knew physical darkness, and he didn't waste any time about it. It says he took some mud, he spit on the ground and created some mud, and he created a paste. And he put that on the man's eye, and he said to the man that gave him instructions of what to do. We don't know if there's any magic in the saliva, magic in the mud. We know this, that Jesus was sent here by the Father. The blind man was sent by Jesus to the pool with some specific instructions. The man followed Jesus' instructions to the letter. And guess what? He received his sight. If you follow God's instructions, great things can happen. And this man did just that. It was an act of faith on his part. He followed those instructions to the T. Now look and see what happens beginning in verse 8. It said, his neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was. Others said, no, he only looks like him. But he himself insisted, I am the man. How then are your eyes opened? They demanded. He replied, the man they called Jesus made some mud, put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash, so I went and washed, and then I could see. Where is this man, they asked. I don't know, he said. This is often the case. Jesus performs a miracle, then he disappears. He doesn't hang around for the accolades. The interesting point of view here of the neighbors is interesting to see and important to think about. When this man was blind, they had a different point of view of him. And then after he gets his sight back, they don't recognize him. Now, he wouldn't recognize them either because he had never seen any of them. They didn't know what a person could be with sight as opposed to being blind. They didn't know what he would look like. They didn't even know if this was really the beggar. He looked so different to them. He said, I am the man. And of course, the first thing they wanted to know was, how did you get your sight back? And so he tells them, he becomes Jesus' witness here in that. Look in verses 13 and following. Didn't take long for the Pharisees to find out about it. They brought to the Pharisees this man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. So some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, how can a sinner do such miraculous signs? So they were divided. Finally, they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes that he opened. The man replied, he is a prophet. Now, the argument that the Pharisees make here is, if somebody violates the Sabbath, how can they be a prophet or anybody who can do anything good? This man must not be on the up and up if he violates the Sabbath. But what about the recipient of Jesus' grace? Immediately, he's a prophet. He's more powerful than we are in what he can do. And prophets had performed miraculous signs before. All you have to do is look back in the Old Testament, and you can see some of those things that they did, even to the point of restoring people to life. So beginning here in verse 13, we see a series of interrogations that go forth with this blind man. And you could understand that. If you knew someone who was an adult, had been blind from birth, and all of a sudden they could see, people are going to want to know, how did this happen? So the first of these question and answer sessions that will happen was with the Pharisees. And so it ultimately would come down not to sight, but Jesus violating the Sabbath. The thinking, though an error was logical, is illegal under God's law to do work on the Sabbath. Jesus healed this man, placing moistened clay on his eyes. That is work. Therefore, Jesus is breaking the law of God. No one who breaks the law of God could be a true prophet of God. That's how the Pharisees thought. No one. Despite the charge, the blind beggar he defends his benefactor. He says that I'm bound to believe in him because all that he's done for me. I've been blind all my life. I've never seen anything. I was born blind. And here comes a person along who restores my sight. He's a prophet. He's not a sinner. You don't need to do anything bad to him. But the rumblings are still continuing. Look in verse 18. The Jews still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. Is this your son, they asked? Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see? We know he is our son, the parents answered, and we know he was born blind. But how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself. The parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for already the Jews had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Christ would be put out of the synagogue. They'd be excommunicated. That is why his parents said, he's of age. Ask him. Now, this second interrogation is of the parents and not of the man who was healed. And so they ask his parents these important questions. Is he your son? Yes. Was he born blind? Yes. How is it that he can see? They pass the buck. Well, ask him. He's old enough. He's an adult. Ask him. He'll tell you why he can see. And so they go back to him a second time in verse 24. A second time they summoned the man who had been blind. Give glory to God, they said. We know this man is a sinner. Not the blind man, but Jesus. This man is a sinner. He replied, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. This third interrogation was the blind man back at the Pharisees, but this final statement that he makes is got to be considered conclusive and unchallengeable because of the way that he says it. It is the simple fact of the Christian experience that many people may not be able to put into theological terms like the Pharisees wanted them to do, theologically correct terms, but they know what's happened to them. And they can be a witness to what's happened to them. And that's exactly what this blind man did. He was a witness. He says, I don't know about any of this other stuff, that you're talking about. But for me, he speaks the truth as I've experienced it. And I know this. I was blind, but now I see. The man did not feel qualified to judge whether Jesus was a sinner, but he was an honest witness. And he could give an honest witness of Jesus to these people. And he did. He did it without reservation. He knew what these people could do to him as far as the synagogue and the temple were concerned. We'll see where that ends up. But he testifies, I was blind, but I can see, and Jesus is the person who did it. Look at verse 26. Then they asked him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered, I've told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? Then they hurled insults at him and said, you are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. How did he open your eyes? That's the fourth time he's been asked this question in this short period of time. By now, he's become obvious from his answer that he's grown weary of the failure of people to understand or believe what has happened to him. They still want to believe he's committed a sin, and they want to put Jesus in the same category, that he's a sinner. At this point, the goal of the Pharisees was to discredit Jesus in any way that they could. But he said, I already told you. I told you already. This comes across as the reader, as the blind beggar getting irritated with the Pharisees, saying to them in so many words, you're not listening and I'm not telling you again. To which the only response was to insult him and to insult Jesus. They cling to Moses as their mentor. They reject Jesus, the Son of God, and any teaching or demonstration of his power. And here's the man's response to that in verse 30. The man answered, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly man who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. He said, haven't you been listening to me? This is really an irrefutable argument because he has the evidence to prove what Jesus can do. First, he finds it really strange that these people who call themselves men of God would not want to find out more about this remarkable man. He says, that's remarkable. In fact, the words he used here is that he's incredulous with these people. The simple, lonely man not to be intimidated. He speaks the truth as he experienced it. The man's witness has become more convincing, more appealing each time he's been challenged or questioned. He makes the argument that Jesus must not be a sinner if he can do these things. God listens to him and to someone who does his will. No one has been born blind to ever have his sight restored, he says. Now, I don't know how he knew that. There's no book of records in that time. But I know from what we know about modern medicine, and I'm not a doctor, but I know this, that when someone's born blind, it's extremely rare that their sight is ever restored. He was born blind, and his sight was restored completely. And so he's an amazing example of what Jesus can do. And so he says, no man can accomplish what this man has accomplished unless he came from God. It seemed incredible to this man that the Pharisees would not know this man who had opened his eyes, and perhaps he even knew about other miracles that Jesus had performed. Why aren't the Pharisees trying to find out about him instead of looking for ways to discredit him? And we know that they wanted to kill him. That's already been said. These experts of the law, these experts, the Pharisees, they're rejecting the stone, as talked about in 4:11. Jesus was the rejected stone, the cornerstone. The Pharisees have not gone from now, though, in the presence of this formerly blind beggar, who apparently was smarter than they thought. They've gone from being the prosecutors to becoming the prosecuted. Obviously, these great teachers of the Jewish faith did not like to be upstaged by this beggar. The man had not only successfully countered each of their arguments, but now he had turned his arguments back on to them and stubbornly refused to accept the logic. They stubbornly refused to accept the logic of his experience. I ran across an excellent quote by Kent Hughes that sort of described the situation here of this blind man. He says, "The light of the world had gone out into the dark world, with the result that a blind man saw not only with his eyes, but also with his heart. And those who had vision were blinded because they refused to believe. Those who know the truth but do not turn to Christ are lost. Those who know they are blind are the ones to whom Jesus can give sight." Jesus came to open the eyes of the blind, to give sight to those who could not see. And so how did they reply to this man's argument? They didn't have any other way to reply to him except to accuse him. To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. There's two things here. They said, "We know the cause of your blindness, because at birth you were already steeped in sin. You had committed sin after sin for some reason in your mother's womb, or perhaps it was from your forefathers who passed it on to you." And so they threw him out. They excommunicated him from the synagogue and from the temple. He would not be welcomed any longer. Here was their answer. Instead of investigating more about Jesus in a friendly way, they would ignore him and they would punish anybody who followed him. When threatened by the truth, they acted as they normally did and resorted to attacking the character of their foe. They attacked the character of this man, the beggar, and they attacked the character of Jesus as well. You're steeped in sin. Like Jesus' disciples who questioned the reason for the man being born blind, the Pharisees associated his blindness with sin, and they said, "You're full of it, you're full of sin." And then they threw him out, excommunicated him. Now, we might think, wow, he's better off. But to a Jew, to be excommunicated from the temple, to be excommunicated from the synagogue, that was a terrible fate. He could no longer bring sacrifices to the temple. And that was the way to get forgiveness for sin, to offer a sacrifice for sins that they have committed. This was a terrible day for him. But I don't think that this man worried about it. He had his sight, and he knew who had given it to him. Look at verse 35, because Jesus is not through with this man. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. And when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." Typical of Jesus. Jesus went out and found this man. Somehow he found out what had happened to him when he had been questioned by the Pharisees. And it's so often the case, Jesus becomes the seeker. Jesus is always the seeker. He's always knocking at the door of someone's heart, asking them to let him in. And so he becomes the seeker here. And when he heard that this blind beggar had been dismissed, he went out and found him. And the first question he asked him, he's witnessing, he says, "Do you believe?" And again, we come across John's discussion about how do you become a Christian, really. It's through simple belief. Belief. Christianity is a belief system. Jesus was offering him that opportunity to believe. It's not enough to believe that he's a man called Jesus or even a prophet. He already said he's a prophet or a man of God. Jesus wanted him to express faith that he is the Son of God. And he doesn't say, "in me." He wants to know about his feelings concerning the Son of Man. And so Jesus goes to find him, and he begins to talk to the beggar. And the beggar wants to know, who is he? Who is the Son of Man? If you tell me who he is, then I want to express faith in him. And so in verse 37, Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. You've now seen him. Jesus brings the miracle back in, because to that point, that man had seen no one. He had not seen a thing. He had never seen a sunrise. He had never seen a flower blooming. He had never seen the people who passed by and gave him alms. He had never seen anyone. Now, Jesus could have responded, "I am he." But he wanted him to remember the miracle that he had performed. And he says, "So you have now seen him, because I know you haven't seen anything in the past, but now you've seen him." And he says, "He is the one speaking with you." Jesus wasn't playing a guessing game here. He wanted this man to understand exactly who he was. And the scripture says that as soon as Jesus said that, this blind beggar, formerly blind beggar, he worshiped Jesus. Wouldn't you? Been blind all your life? We don't know how old this man was. He was an adult. And all of a sudden, after all those years of darkness and not seeing anything, this person comes along and restores your sight, and you would worship someone like that who had restored your sight or given you sight. There was no restoration of sight. This was sight for the first time. And his immediate response is that he worshiped him. We're not told how he did, but we know that he did. Look at verse 39. Jesus says, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, "What? Are we blind too?" Jesus says, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains." It's an interesting verse here. Interesting verses. If you were blind, here at the close of the passage, Jesus preaches a brief sermon to these Pharisees. If they were blind, they would not be guilty, because they wouldn't be able to see what Jesus had done. They wouldn't know what Jesus had done. They would not be guilty of failing to have the spiritual insight to see for Jesus for who he really was. But since they professed to have sight to see, they stood guilty of willful blindness. You mean this man had never seen? Now he sees and he believes. The reason for our Lord's coming was salvation, but the result of his coming was condemnation of those who would not believe. And that's something we don't want to talk about very often. We like to quote John 3:16. If you believe on Jesus, you'll have eternal life. But the converse of that is true also. If you don't believe on Jesus, you'll have eternal damnation, eternal punishment. And Jesus is saying, you're now sighted. You'd be better off blind, but now you've been told. And if you don't respond like this man responded, then you're going to suffer the consequences. Now, the religious leaders were blind, and they would not admit it. Therefore, the light of truth only made them more blind, because they saw, and they, as one writer said, they had willful blindness. Blindness that would not excuse anything that they knew. If you knew about Jesus, if you know about Jesus, you're not excused. In fact, Paul writes in Romans that no one has an excuse. Even if you've not met Jesus personally, which I haven't. We have the Scriptures. We have nature even. He says, if you've not even seen the Scriptures, nature should tell you about God. But they did not know what was going on. They refused to know it. They did see it, but they refused to know it. James L. Sullivan observed that physical eyes open, they were blind with willful sightlessness. So, as we think about this story, it's an interesting story. Very interesting story. And here's the summation of it all. Here was one solitary human being who had never seen the face of his parents are his friends, nor the beauty of a sunrise or a lily. Blind from birth, says the record, as each of us is born spiritually blind. And Jesus sees him as he passed by, and he stops. For him, no one is ever lost in the crowd. He knows each of us, where we are, and what our need is. This is our hope. This is the amazing grace that Jesus has been willing to bring into this world. I couldn't think of any other song that fit this story better than the story that's behind Amazing Grace and the words to Amazing Grace. Most of you know that Amazing Grace was written by John Newton. John Newton grew up in a seafaring family. He became a captain of a ship that participated in the slave trade. And through some of his readings and through experiences that he had participating in the trade that brought slaves to the West Indies mostly, and even to the United States, to the American colonies, he became convinced that what he was doing was wrong. He became a Christian. He became an Anglican pastor. He participated with Wilberforce in having slavery abolished in England. And he wrote this amazing hymn that really is sort of a classic story of how we all become Christians and how he became a Christian. Now, we only have 5 stanzas of it in our hymnal, but I'm going to read to you 7 stanzas here that he has written. Look at the words here. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. The Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be as long as life endures. Yea, when this flesh and heart shall fail, and mortal life shall cease, I shall possess within the veil a life of joy and peace. The earth shall soon dissolve like snow, the sun forbear to shine, but God, who called me here below, will be forever mine. We've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun. We've no less days to sing God's praise than when we had first begun. And this has become a classic tune, classic song, a hymn throughout the world for all people who have faith in Jesus Christ. It is a hymn of faith for all of us. Let's sing that first stanza together. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. I hope that you're able to do like the blind man, the blind beggar, to say, I once was blind, but now I see because of Jesus Christ. That's my prayer for you. Have a good week.